In this screencast, we're going to be looking at different levels of biological organization, and specifically the level of organ systems. So the question is, how do we get from a cell to this very complex system that is you? So the first thing we have to understand here is that for any multicellular organism, it's important that those cells are able to coordinate and cooperate together to perform whatever their tasks are with keeping you alive. So these cells are what we call specialized. In other words, if you look at, your classic drawing of a cell, and you've got like a cell and your nucleus and your different organelles in there, and they all kind of look the same. They're this round cell with all the various organelles. In reality, a lot of cells don't actually look like this nice round cell with all the organelles. They come in a lot of different shapes and sizes and different compositions of how many of which organelles are in there. And that's because different cells in a multicellular organism have different jobs to do. So just for an example, here are 4 different cells, and some of these are not from multicellular organisms and some of them are. See if you can guess what these cells are for or from. So we've got right here is a nerve cell or a neuron, and you notice very different shape. It's got kind of like this star-ish shape in the middle with all of these different projections coming out of it. Here we've got a red blood cell, which looks a little bit like an inner tube, and its job is carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide in your blood. Over here we've got bacteria, which are single-celled organisms, and they're kind of shaped like little pills. And then we've got an amoeba over here, which is a eukaryotic single-celled organism, and it needs to be able to sort of crawl around and find food. So just notice these are just 4 different cells, but there's a lot of different kinds, how different they look. And that's because they're all specialized to perform their function, or in the case of these, to live on their own. And so all of your cells, different types of cells, are kind of different. So now let's look at the levels of organization. So how we get specifically from a cell to a organ system. So we start with cells, and here's an example, a muscle cell, which is another specialized cell. Notice it has its own sort of unique shape. A group of these specialized cells working together makes up a tissue. So muscle tissue, or your muscles, is an example of a tissue. Groups of tissues working together can make up organs. And so here's an example of an organ, which is the bladder. And then groups of these organs and other tissues working together can make up organ systems, which have a certain task or job to carry out within the body. So in this case, it's the excretory system, where you have your kidneys, which are organs filtering blood to remove waste products or maintain the right salt and water balance. That travels through the ureter into the bladder and then out the urethra as urine. So it's this whole system of different organs working together to accomplish the task of excreting waste and maintaining water and salt balance in the body. So let's look at just a few examples of organ systems. And if you're interested in this particular screencast or any of this stuff, you might want to consider taking anatomy, because that's going to give you a lot more information about these, but we're just going to look at a couple. So one example of a system is the respiratory system. So the respiratory system's job is to move carbon dioxide out of your body and oxygen in. So the main organ that's involved in this is the lungs. But there's also, say, the muscles of the diaphragm that help expand and contract your lungs. There's all the various tubing that the air goes in and out of. So this is a system. So those themes of diffusion and also surface area to volume ratio actually play a pretty big role in most of these systems. For example, diffusion within the lungs, so you breathe in the air, And then the air is taken into these little sacs in the lungs. And from there, oxygen needs to diffuse out from these sacs and into the bloodstream. And then carbon dioxide needs to diffuse out of the blood and into the lungs, where it can then be breathed out the next time you breathe out. So that's an example of how diffusion is being used in the body. Surface area to volume ratio is also important. One way that surface area to volume ratio can be increased is by having things smaller. Another way is by increasing, let's use the very scientific term, squiggliness. So if you take, for example, a flat piece of paper, that takes up a certain amount of space. If you scrunch it up into a ball, you can get it much more compact and taking up less space, but still maintaining all of the same surface area. So if you were to spread out your lungs completely and all of the little squiggles in them, it would cover a massive amount of area. But by having them all squiggled and scrunched and branching like this, they increase their surface area while still fitting into your chest, which allows a lot more surface area for this diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide to take place. Another system is your digestive system. And so the digestive system's job is to break down and absorb all those nutrients and energy-containing molecules from your food. And it contains a lot of different organs, including your stomach, intestines, liver, etc., to get that job done. And once again, we see the concepts of diffusion and surface area to volume ratio coming into play. You might notice that your intestines are very squiggly, and that is to fit more surface area, again, into you, because these nutrients from the food and water, sugar, etc., that are in your intestines need to be absorbed inside of the cells in your intestines. And so all of that squiggliness gives them a lot of surface area to absorb and diffuse across. It's even more so because if you zoom in, if this is the lining of your intestine, if you zoom in even more on that lining, you'll find that there's all these little projections. There's even more surface area in there for absorption. The nervous system isn't a system that we're going to talk about, but you might also notice, think about a brain. What does a brain look like? Squiggly. Because you essentially do your thinking on the surface of the brain. More squiggly brain, more surface area. Some sort of lower intelligence animals, I guess you could say, have more of a smooth brain, less surface area for thinking on. And the last system we're going to look at in this video is the cardiovascular system. So the cardiovascular system kind of centers around the heart, and the main purpose of that is to circulate blood all through the body. And so one key thing to understand about these various organ systems is that much like how you're a multicellular organisms and your cells aren't operating alone, your organ systems aren't operating alone either. These are all interconnected and working together. So just looking at the examples that we looked at, the respiratory system takes the oxygen into the blood, the digestive system absorbs those nutrients into the blood, and then the cardiovascular system is responsible for circulating that blood all around the body. So bringing that blood to the lungs to pick up more oxygen and put out CO2, bringing that blood to the kidneys to dispose of waste or unneeded materials, bringing that blood to the digestive system and the intestines to absorb the nutrients out of it, and bringing that blood around to all of the cells so that they can get their nutrients, their oxygen from the blood and put out their waste, which then again gets circulated around to be disposed of. So all of these systems are actually working together in order to keep your body going.